What if the biggest trade deal in North America just became a geopolitical chessboard, and most Americans have no idea what's at stake? Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum just locked down the USMCA agreement, but here's what the headlines won't tell you. This isn't just about tariffs or trade flows. China is positioning itself as the silent third player in a game that will determine whether the United States maintains its economic sovereignty or slowly hemorrhages industrial capacity to Beijing's long game. Sheinbaum's move signals Mexico's intention to be more than a manufacturing corridor. It's a declaration of strategic autonomy at a time when Washington can least afford to lose influence south of the border. The real question isn't whether the USMCA survives, it's whether America understands that trade agreements are now theaters of great power competition. China doesn't need to invade markets, it infiltrates them through supply chains, infrastructure deals, and patient capital that plays by different rules. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition, and if we don't wake up to how deeply integrated Chinese influence has become in our own backyard, we'll find ourselves negotiating from weakness in a world we thought we controlled. Let's start by understanding what just happened, because the surface narrative and the deeper reality are miles apart. Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first female president, didn't just secure the USMCA, she's navigating one of the most complex geopolitical triangulations in modern history. And if you think this is simply about maintaining trade relations between the United States, Mexico, and Canada, you're missing the forest for the trees. This is about something far more consequential: the reordering of global supply chains, the quiet infiltration of Chinese economic power into the Western Hemisphere, and the question of whether North America can maintain its integrated economic bloc in the face of Beijing's patient, methodical strategy to become the indispensable node in global manufacturing and trade. When the USMCA was renegotiated under the Trump administration to replace NAFTA, the stated goal was to rebalance trade relationships, bring manufacturing back to North America, and reduce dependency on China. That was the promise. The reality, however, has been far more complicated. Mexico became the primary beneficiary of nearshoring, the process by which American companies moved production out of China and into closer proximity to the United States. On paper, this looks like a win for the North American bloc. Mexican exports to the United States surged, factories sprouted across northern Mexico, and supply chains shortened. But here's what didn't make the headlines. A significant portion of that nearshoring boom involved Chinese companies setting up shop in Mexico, using it as a backdoor into the American market. This isn't speculation, this is documented fact. Chinese investment in Mexican manufacturing has exploded over the past 5 years, and much of it is strategically designed to circumvent tariffs and trade restrictions that would apply to goods shipped directly from China. So when Sheinbaum secures the USMCA, the question we need to ask is, secure it for whom? Is this an agreement that strengthens North American economic integration, or has it become a Trojan horse through which Chinese economic influence flows unchecked into the very heartland of American industry? The answer is uncomfortable, and it requires us to think several moves ahead on the chessboard. China doesn't operate like Western powers. It doesn't need to win today. It can afford to play a game that unfolds over decades, embedding itself so deeply into supply chains, infrastructure, and financial systems that by the time we realize what's happened, extraction becomes impossible without causing massive self-inflicted damage. Consider the automotive industry, which is the backbone of the USMCA's economic rationale. The agreement includes strict rules of origin requirements, meaning that a certain percentage of a vehicle's components must be made in North America for it to qualify for tariff-free treatment. The intention was clear: keep production in North America, prevent Chinese components from flooding the market under the guise of Mexican or Canadian manufacturing. But enforcement is another matter entirely. Chinese firms have become extraordinarily adept at creating joint ventures, shell companies, and localized production facilities that technically comply with rules of origin while still funneling profits, intellectual property, and strategic control back to Beijing. We're not talking about small-scale operations here. We're talking about billions of dollars in investment, entire industrial parks, and supply chain ecosystems that are ostensibly Mexican but are in reality extensions of Chinese state-directed economic strategy. And this brings us to a deeper problem that most analysts refuse to confront. The United States is simultaneously trying to decouple from China while maintaining a consumer economy that is structurally dependent on cheap Chinese goods. This is an impossible contradiction, and China knows it. Beijing understands that America's political class can talk tough on China, pass legislation restricting Chinese access to sensitive technologies, and even impose tariffs. But at the end of the day, American consumers want affordable products and American corporations want profit margins. So what happens? The production moves from Shenzhen to Monterrey, the labels change, the paperwork gets shuffled, but the underlying dependencies remain. China doesn't lose access to the American market, it just reroutes through Mexico. And in the process it gains even more leverage because now it's not just a distant manufacturing hub, it's embedded in our own neighborhood, intertwined with our closest trading partner. Sheinbaum is playing a difficult hand here, and we should be clear about that. Mexico's economy is heavily dependent on its relationship with the United States, but it also needs foreign investment, infrastructure development, and access to capital. China offers all of that without the political conditionality that often comes with American or European investment. Beijing doesn't lecture about human rights, labor standards, or democratic governance. It offers cash, builds ports, finances factories, and asks for very little in return, at least not upfront. The costs come later, and they come in the form of strategic dependency. Once a country's infrastructure is built by Chinese firms, financed by Chinese banks, and integrated into Chinese supply chains, the ability to pivot away becomes exponentially harder. This is the playbook that China has used across Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. And now it's being deployed in Latin America, right on the United States' doorstep. The timing of Sheinbaum's consolidation of the USMCA is also critical. We're entering a period of profound global realignment. The post-Cold War unipolar moment is over. American hegemony, as we understood it for the past 3 decades, is being contested in ways both overt and subtle. China is not trying to replace the United States as the global hegemon in the traditional sense. It doesn't need to. What it's doing is far more insidious. It's creating parallel systems, alternative institutions, and redundant supply chains that make it progressively harder for the United States to leverage its economic and political power. The Belt and Road Initiative is the most visible manifestation of this, but it's far from the only one. China is building a world where American influence becomes optional, where countries can choose between Washington and Beijing, and increasingly they're hedging their bets or choosing Beijing outright because the terms are more attractive. Now, let's talk about what this means for American workers, because this isn't just an abstract geopolitical chess game, it has real consequences for real people. The promise of nearshoring was that manufacturing jobs would return to North America. To some extent, that has happened. Mexican factories are booming, and some of that benefits American workers through integrated supply chains. But if those factories are ultimately controlled or heavily influenced by Chinese capital, then the strategic benefit to the United States is minimal. We're not rebuilding American industrial capacity, we're just outsourcing it to a different location, one that happens to be geographically closer but economically aligned with our primary strategic competitor. The jobs created in Mexico don't translate into jobs in Michigan or Ohio. The intellectual property developed in those facilities doesn't stay in North American hands. The profits don't circulate within our economy. They flow outward, often back to Beijing, leaving behind a hollowed-out industrial base and communities that were promised revitalization but got more of the same decline. This is where the moral dimension of global economics becomes unavoidable. We're often told that free trade benefits everyone, that comparative advantage ensures optimal outcomes, and that interference in markets is economically irrational. But these are ideological assertions, not empirical truths. The reality is that trade is a tool of statecraft, and nations that understand this, like China, use it strategically to advance their interests. Nations that pretend economics and politics are separate domains, like the United States has often done, end up getting played. China subsidizes industries not because it makes short-term economic sense, but because it secures long-term strategic advantage. It invests in foreign infrastructure not out of altruism, but to create dependencies that can be leveraged when needed. It floods markets with below-cost goods not to benefit consumers, but to destroy competitors and dominate entire sectors. And it works because Western nations, constrained by free market orthodoxy and corporate lobbying, refuse to respond in kind. Sheinbaum's securing of the USMCA should be understood in this context. She's trying to position Mexico as an indispensable partner to the United States while also keeping the door open to Chinese investment. This is a rational strategy from Mexico's perspective, but it creates enormous risks for the United States. If Washington takes the relationship for granted, assumes that geographic proximity and historical ties are enough to ensure alignment, it will wake up one day to find that its most important trading partner has been quietly integrated into a Chinese-led economic sphere. And at that point, the options become far more limited and far more painful. There's also the question of what happens when economic competition transitions into something more confrontational. Right now, we're in a phase of economic rivalry, but history teaches us that great power competition doesn't stay economic forever. It spills over into military posturing, alliance formation, and eventually conflict. If China has deeply embedded itself in Mexican industry, if Chinese firms control critical infrastructure, if supply chains that feed American consumers run through Chinese-controlled nodes in Mexico, then what happens in a crisis? What happens if tensions over Taiwan escalate? What happens if the South China Sea becomes a theater of military confrontation? Suddenly, the dependencies we casually accepted during peacetime become vulnerabilities during conflict, and the leverage that seemed merely economic reveals itself to be strategic and potentially coercive. We need to be honest about something else. The American political system is structurally ill-equipped to handle this kind of long-term strategic competition. Our political cycles are short, our attention spans even shorter, and our policy continuity is almost non-existent. China operates on 5-year plans, 10-year horizons, and generational timelines. The United States operates on quarterly earnings reports and 2-year election cycles. This is not a fair fight, and unless we fundamentally rethink how we approach strategy, we're going to continue losing ground. Sheinbaum's actions are a reminder that other countries are making their own strategic calculations, and those calculations are increasingly shaped by the perception that China is ascendant and America is distracted, divided, and declining. But here's the thing, it doesn't have to be this way. The United States still has enormous advantages: technological innovation, capital markets, military power, cultural influence, and a network of allies that China cannot replicate. What we lack is the political will to use those advantages strategically. We need an industrial policy that isn't just about subsidies and tariffs, but about rebuilding productive capacity, investing in workers, and ensuring that supply chains for critical goods are secure and resilient. We need a trade policy that recognizes that not all trade is beneficial, that strategic industries require protection, and that partnerships must be reciprocal and aligned with our long-term interests. And we need a foreign policy that understands that economic statecraft is not a sideshow, it's the main event. Mexico, under Sheinbaum, is going to do what's best for Mexico. That's her job. The question is whether the United States has leaders who are willing to do what's best for the United States, even when it's difficult, even when it requires confronting powerful corporate interests, and even when it means making short-term sacrifices for long-term security. The USMCA is a framework, but frameworks are only as strong as the commitment behind them. If we're serious about maintaining North American integration as a counterweight to Chinese influence, we need to invest in that vision, not just with words, but with resources, policies, and a clear-eyed understanding of what's at stake. And if we're not willing to do that, then we should stop pretending that trade agreements alone are going to protect us from a competitor that thinks in terms of decades and plays to win.